Okay, welcome everybody. It's so nice to see a big turnout today. So welcome, welcome all to BRIA. So this is our regular Thursday seminar, and today we have two speakers. On the one hand, we have Maurits Meijers from the University of Antwerp, and then we have Emmy Eklundh from the University of Cardiff University. So the program will be a bit different today, so we will start with the two presentations first, and each of them will talk for about 30 minutes, and then afterwards there's a very short break, but don't run away because we will have a discussion afterwards for the two papers together. So let me first introduce you to Caroline, who will introduce Maurits Meijers.
Thank you, Sylvia. It's very nice to see such an attendance today. We know it's June, it's exam session, lots of people have different things to do, so it's very nice, and I thank everyone who is present today. So as Sylvia said, Maurits Meijers is research professor of political science at the University of Antwerp. Previously, he worked as an associate professor at Radboud University. I also know Maurits as the co-editor-in-chief of the journal Politics of the Low Country, so if you want to submit a paper, you can discuss that after the seminar. And Maurits' current research examines how representative democracy comes under pressure from political lying, populism, and party behavior, and how citizens and elites respond. He is the principal investigator of Demo Lies, an ERC-funded project studying political lying accusations, how citizens perceive them, and what they mean for democratic citizenship across Western democracies. Congratulations on the ERC, by the way. Come on.
All right. Thank you, Caroline, for this nice introduction. So today I will talk about political lying as a concept and what that means for democracy. So the title is "Lies, Damned Lies, and Politics," as a pun on the famous quote, "How citizens make sense of political deception and what it means for democracy." And this is a joint work with Marta Verdegem, Simon McManus, Tom Bellens, and Daniel Polman, the last of whom is at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. So when we talk about lies in politics, you will likely think of examples like this. Trump's claim that he had the highest turnout ever for his 2017 inauguration. Very recently in Flanders, it was shown that Annelien van Bossuit did know that she had to pay dwangsommen, a fine, and that she misled Parliament knowingly. In the Netherlands, we had the case that the government, not the previous government, the government before that fell because of disagreement over immigration, which was based on information that in the end turned out to not be true, and she knowingly spread this information. And then we have Boris Johnson's claim that that anyone who thinks I lied about lockdown parties is out of their mind, after which footage was shown that he was actually there. So these are kind of these classic cases what we think of political lying. However, when we ask citizens to identify what they see as cases of political lying, a very different picture emerges, and that's exactly what I want to talk to you about. So, for instance, and I will come to that, I did focus group discussions with people in Antwerp, and one N-VA voter said, well, a real case of lying for me is that in 2014, the N-VA entered the federal government because they were for independent Flanders. That's why I voted for them, and they did something else. So that's a lie to their voters. Other participants said, also in the Flemish context, these are quotes by Conrad Rousseau, which I will not repeat. They are extremely sexist and racist. And they said, for me, it's a lie when a person who is supposed to be part of a progressive party, the leader of a progressive party, then says things that are completely at odds with that ideology. So his leadership as such is a lie? And that's the puzzle, and that's kind of this insight that I want to start with and unpack further today. So, what is true or not is as old as politics itself, right? So we have all these nice historical accounts in ancient Greece where also their deception and framing was used to lead and mislead the public. But today, we have often said and heard that we live in an age of disinformation and in a post-truth society where all of this becomes more relevant. And well, when we think about lying in politics, there's not a lot of research done about this. So sure, in psychology and in communication science, there's a lot of research about fake news, misinformation, disinformation, also health disinformation, and then within this context, okay, when do people accept fake news messages? When do they reject it? How can we inoculate people against this? Or how can we train them to reject fake news? So there's a lot of great and important research done in that regard. But what is always kind of clear in this, or taken as a given in this research, is that what is true and what isn't. And my take on this is that, well, it's a bit of a problem that we pay so little attention to citizens' perceptions of lying, or if we turn it on its head, citizens' perception of what is true and what is not true. Because what is a lie and what is not a lie is a deeply political act. And we can think of truth and lies, or truth and falsehoods as this balanced scales, whereas actually there is an objective truth. And that is important, but if we take the citizen's perspective seriously, we kind of also have to step away from that a little bit to appreciate that what is true and what is not true is contested, and that it's empirically relevant to study it. So that doesn't mean that there is no truth, embracing kind of this post-truth idea. No, sure, there is truth, but to understand why people say certain things are lies and certain things are not lies, we have to kind of step away from this fact, okay, from this standard of this is true, and we're going to test how people respond to fake or messages that deviate from that, and see what do citizens themselves perceive to be true and not true. So that is the research gap that I want to address in this project. So how do citizens make sense of political lying, and how does it affect their democratic attitudes? And specifically, it's unclear what citizens perceive to be political lies in the first place, which citizens and which types of citizens see more lies than others, and how it affects their democracy. So the question here is really, the focus is really on citizens' perceptions of lying, and it's not a question of ontology, right? In philosophy, you can study what is true and what is there, and these are all important things, but that's not the focus. It's also not the focus is not on fact-checking on how people relate to some kind of objective standard. So this project is funded in two ways. So we have the Politics is Monkey Business project, which was funded by the Dutch Science Council already a while ago, but still kind of the research, the funding has stopped, but the research is still ongoing, in which I am the PI and work together with Daniel Polman, and the ERC project that Caroline mentioned, which started last year, which is a slightly broader project, which is about political lying accusations, also on elite level, studying how elites accuse each other of lying, kind of this question of truth contestation at elite level, and then studying how citizens perceive this. So, what will I talk about today? So first, I will talk a little bit about defining political lies from a kind of a conceptual point of view and the citizen perspective on that. Then I say who sees which, I'll talk about who sees which political lies, and then what does that mean for democracy. So, starting with the conceptual question, the question is, okay, what is a lie and what is a political lie? And you would kind of think, oh, isn't that obvious? Anything that's not true is a lie. Well, as things are, if you delve more deeply in research, everything is more complicated than it seems, because actually this is a question that's been studied quite extensively in applied philosophy and in linguistics. For instance, this very nice book from the 1980s by Sisela Bock discusses what lying is, and also the historical writings around it. So lying is a contested concept, but we borrow from Mr. Meijers, who is featured here, and he basically outlines 4 conditions. So the first condition is that it needs to be a statement. So lying is essentially a linguistic act. So you can do something that is deceptive, but it needs to be a linguistic act for it to count as a lie, which of course excludes many other concepts. Then there's the untruthfulness condition, which, and this is quite crucial, the speaker who speaks the lie has to believe it's false. Right? So it might actually be true what the person is saying if it turns out to be true, but the speaker has to think it's false. Then it needs to be addressed to someone. If you say, if you lie to yourself in the mirror, sure, but that's not a lie. There needs to be an addressee. And the last point is a point of some contestation, but most people say, well, there has to be an intention to deceive. And also there's a very rich literature between people who believe that, the deceptionists and the non-deceptionists, and we can talk about that later if you're interested. So this is a very interesting and rich conceptual literature. But most people adhere to this idea that, okay, that you have to kind of have the intention to deceive others. Well, what makes it political? This literature is markedly smaller, so there's a lot of literature on lying. Political lying is really not studied conceptually a lot, but it has to be some kind of politically relevant actor, a broad public audience in the public domain, so not private. If we think about the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, for instance, that's of course a private affair that then became public and politically salient. So first, perhaps the lie was to his wife. Well, then it's a private affair, but then once it enters the public domain, it's not private. And then also the lie is then also for political benefit. So again, it's not private gain, but for political benefit, although, of course, that can also be kind of contested. So there's a lot of concepts surrounding political lies that are interesting and relevant, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but it's important to note that conceptually there are differences. So misinformation, the important difference there is that there's no necessarily belief, does not need to be believed to be false, and actually the intention to deceive is also should not be there, this check mark. So this can be a mistake. That's misinformation. Political disinformation then is a broader term where we can also have non-linguistic acts and deep fakes and all of these things. And also it does not have to be false, right? You can frame something in a certain way to mislead that is not, according to the strict definition, not necessarily a lie, but you paint reality in such a picture, or you frame it in such a way that it's not, that you still convey a misleading message. Well, fake news, this is often studied in a media context. And then political bullshit is an interesting one because there, it's addressed to the public, but it does not have to be false. Political bullshit is this disregard for the truth. You don't care if something is true or not. And actually, I think if we look at Trump, a lot of the things he's saying might be lies, but there can also be a lot of bullshit. He doesn't care whether what he says is true or not. It's just kind of a disregard for the truth. No deliberate intention to mislead or to deceive, but no care about that. Okay, so that's this conceptual literature. How do citizens then think about this? So what we did is we did focus groups, and I will share with you some very preliminary evidence from focus groups where we had discussions with citizens and also vignettes of different examples where we were manipulating these different elements of the definition to see what they find important. So we did these focus groups in the University of Antwerp at the Antwerp Social Lab, which is a great resource. And we will do additional focus groups in Bristol, actually in the UK, later this year. So far we've spoken to about 15 people with a balanced sample of in terms of education, ideology, and gender. People were slightly more higher educated, also due to, and politically interested due to the recruitment through the Antwerp M2P panel. But so far it's been a very interesting and rewarding experience. And so what is kind of is very interesting that we can see there are two types. And this is preliminary because more focus groups have been done this week. And I haven't integrated that yet. But so there is one group who are kind of purists who stay very close to this definition that I just shared with you, who say, well, you need to be an active false statement is necessary. If you evade a question or if you don't answer a question or if you omit some details, that is not a lie. If there is no intent per se, it's also not a lie if you make a mistake or if you forget, and it's really a very strict kind of focus on the claim. Contextualists, this is this other group that I identify, is it's like if it's somehow misleading, it's a kind of lying. Omissions or spinning is also a form of lying. Anything that kind of deviates from full transparency is a lie. And the intent is often kind of inferred because they are politicians, and it's very much focused on the speaker. And among these contextualists, you also see how important political trust is, because those who have low trust say, well, all of this confirms my view on politicians. My trust is completely gone. And a lot of the examples that we saw also went in this direction. Those with high trust, they say, well, selective framing is not necessarily misleading. It is actually leading. That is the core, the essence of politics, to frame and to bring people on side. So that's just someone with relatively high trust, right? So you can see both are kind of contextualists in how they use this definition, but the high trust allows them to have a different take on that. What is very interesting, though, also is that there's that all broken promises, like the one NVA example I discussed in the beginning, are seen as lies. And this is really interesting. It's kind of any electoral pledge or promise that is made that is not fulfilled is seen as lies by all these participants, which I thought was quite surprising, because you would think, well, coalition politics, and you make a promise, and not everything can be held up. But no, people say, well, if you make a promise, you commit to it. And in Dutch and Flemish, you have the saying, belofte maakt schuld, which is hard to translate, but kind of basically a promise is a promise made is a debt owned, right? So if you make a promise, you're indebted to the one you said it to. And that's really interesting. But there's, of course, a kind of a strange temporal dimension here, because when you promise something that is not a lie, it's only when it turns out that you didn't do it that it becomes a lie. So you also see that people do not always have a clear, consistent view on this definition. Okay, so this is preliminary work that I wanted to share with you. I'm very interested to hear what you think about that. I'll go to this other part of the talk, which is about who sees which political lies. And here I rely on very different methods, which is this kind of inductive way of studying people's perceptions of lies at a larger scale quantitatively. So we use here experiencing sampling, the experience sampling method, also known as panel diary studies, which is not often used in political science, but basically it's an app on your phone where you get a notification, hey, can you tell me about your day? And this is used a lot in food research, for instance. When they enter the supermarket, they get a message, what are you buying? How are you feeling? But this is really nice for our purposes as well, because you can capture attitudes in the moment. You can link attitudes to real-world events, and it really can look at these short-term dynamics in opinion. And it allows within-person analysis, because you can compare between weeks a person who's answered different times. So a diary study. So we did this with 900 citizens in a representative sample in the Netherlands. We had a baseline and an exit measurement and 12 weeks of short surveys where people were able to log any lie that they saw. Right? Of course, there is a bit of priming there because we said this survey is about lies that you identify. So that is something you have to take into account. But people were weekly reminded, hey, can you log whatever you saw? And if people saw no lies, that's fine. And if they did see a lie, they got follow-up questions about the content and the speaker of the lie. And they could also spontaneously log some lies. So if we look descriptively, in these 12 weeks, over the 900 respondents, we had 2,800 lies reported in total, which is a lot and way more than I expected. We also see that there's an outlier there with about 60 lies. So he's very active. If we look, if we make that sample shorter, the mean stays quite the same. So, well, what happened in this period in Dutch politics? It was actually quite an interesting time. So there was protests so first actually there were riots in Amsterdam after Maccabi Tel Aviv football fans from the Israeli team Maccabi Tel Aviv came to Amsterdam and then were attacked by citizens in the Netherlands. That sparked a debate about integration and immigration and about anti-Semitism. Related to that was that the state secretary resigned of Moroccan descent over alleged racism and discrimination in the minister council. There was also an education protest. There was a discussion about energy and gas, and there was an energy and a climate ruling as well. So this is the period. And if we look at what did people actually say, what types of examples, I put the English examples here. So you see that again, here many people have a rather broad view on what a lie is. So the first one is about this Amsterdam riots so the mayor of Amsterdam supposedly said nothing is going on and yet riots are breaking out. They did misclassify the party of the mayor of Amsterdam, but that's... Or, for instance, the VVD says that the VVD is the best cure against populism, but they are populists themselves. That is a contradiction. That is a lie. But a more kind of concrete way is about the minister of mobility and transportation, and he increased the speed limit, and he lied about the distance because it's only 46 kilometers, and he said it was longer. So that's kind of a more factual. But also more ideological ones, for instance, about that there was anti-Jewish hatred, and this is caused by refugees who've been allowed in by the left-wing parties. That is something that the respondents saw as a lie on the part of cleared builders. Now, if we look at the issue areas that were most important here on the left, you see that civil rights and immigration and government operations, these were the most often categories that appeared most often, and this is civil rights has to do with anti-Semitism, racism, discrimination. Immigration stands for itself, and government operations in this case was always the state secretary resigning, where people from both sides said, hey, there's something going on. Now, if you look at left-right, there's left-wing respondents and right-wing respondents, we see actually that most right-wing respondents speak more about all these issues on the right-hand side, so defense, education, personal conduct. This is mostly about a specific politician. And on the left, it's about health and culture, but a lot of the most salient issues are actually shared by both. So there's not a clear political angle there. And also here, it's interesting to see if the respondent is on the left-wing respondent, they're in the left column, or a right-wing respondent in the right column. The parties most mentioned as liars are the same, and these are the government parties, right? So, with the far-right populist PVV standing out for both right-wing and respondents and left-wing and centrist respondents. So that's quite interesting. Okay, what then explains on the citizen level what this variation in the perceptions that politicians are lying? We did a binomial regression with these different variables, and I will walk you through the results. So what we find is that having low trust at the beginning of the survey, in this baseline survey, is a predictor of seeing more lies. High trust, less lies. So trust is a key factor that we also saw in the focus groups. Populism and populist attitudes also had an effect. However, when we control for trust, this goes away. We see that right-wing people see more lies, or left-wing people see fewer lies, and politically interested people see more lies. And also with respect to with education, it's middle-educated people compared to low-educated people or vocationally trained people that see a little bit more lies, and there is no real effect of gender and age. Okay, so this paints a picture, right? So we see who are the ones that see these lies and log these lies. These are the people are more right-wing, slightly more right-wing. They're more politically interested, and they have low trust. I think those are key. So now I'll turn to the last question of my talk. Is that, okay, well, what does this all mean for democracy and democratic attitudes? And so what this panel diary setup allows us to do is to study people's trust in politicians and satisfaction with democracy in a way that on a week-by-week basis, right? So we ask people, did you see a lie, yes or no? And we always ask people, what is your satisfaction with democracy? What is your trust in politicians? So that's what we did. We did a panel regression model with the independent variable being whether you saw a lie or not in that week, and also how many lies did you report, right? So we have two measures. Starting with trust, we see there's a clear negative effect, right? So having seen a lie has a quite sizable negative effect on trust. Trust is measured on a 0 to 10 scale, so 0.6 effect is quite sizable. And for satisfaction with democracy, it's very similar type of effect, right? So we see that people who report lies then also are less satisfied with democracy and less trusting of politicians compared to people who did not report a lie in a given week. Now, if we zoom in on those that did have a lie, did see a lie, are there then kind of characteristics of the lie and of the liar that matter? And interestingly, I really thought, okay, it's because you have this whole literature about motivated reasoning, that it's all about party politics. You think the opponents are lying, and your party is not. But we saw already earlier in this descriptive evidence that it's not really the case. And also here, party sympathy, how sympathetic you find the party that the liar belonged to, did not have an effect, both in terms of trust in the party and trust in the politician. Also, how distant ideologically you are as a respondent also did not really matter. What we did see is that, okay, well, if you think this lie is somehow acceptable, because we already saw that sometimes people say, well, this is actually quite acceptable. Sometimes it's also leading, it's not always misleading, but leading in the focus groups. And so some people also said some lies are more justifiable and more acceptable, and that garners more trust in the liar, which is relevant insofar that you see, well, actually we do capture something that is relevant in trust in party. So this, for me, that informs me that this party sympathy, the lack of a party sympathy and the left-right difference effect are important conclusions that we can draw. All right. So I'm going to wrap up now. And so my case for you today here is that we need to study political lying in its own right. It's a political act to identify what is true and what is not true. Fact checks are important, and it's great that media do this. And studies about disinformation calculation is also important, but we need to understand more what do people think are lies, and also how egregious is this. Also, we see that this phenomenon of political lying and identifying lies is a bit broader than the literature, than what we see from the literature and conspiracy beliefs or populist attitudes, right? So there's a portion of the population that adheres to conspiracy belief, but it's a minority. But we see here that really quite a lot of people logged lies. And also with respect to populist attitudes, more people have populist attitudes than vote for populist parties, but still this phenomenon seems to be quite broad, and it's also not explained by that. The understanding that citizens have of political lying is rather broad and also very diverse, and there's more for us to unpack there. I've shared some preliminary focus group evidence, but there's definitely something we want to understand better in the future. And we see that governing parties are often accused of lying. Of course, they're also the most present, most salient in the media. And ideology does not play as much as a role as we thought. And we see, and that's the big conclusion, is that trust is a kind of a key variable. Low trusting citizens have this more broader contextualist understanding of political lying, and they see anything that deviates from full transparency as a lie. They also report more lies in the quantitative study, and it also has a negative, seeing a lie has a negative effect again on lying, which makes this a kind of a vicious circle, right? And the nice thing about this data is that we can say, well, it's not a circular argument that we're making because we have a baseline measure of trust and then number of lies, as well as this panel setup where we see that seeing a lie garners less trust. So what are the next steps in this project? So we're going to do focus groups in the UK. Also, one of the PhD students is going to do a study about comparing kind of lying to other bad behavior, uncivil behavior politicians can do. What is more egregious? How bad is it? We're going to do cross-sectional surveys in 6 countries, European countries, including the US as well, on kind of perceived lying frequency. How bad is this in democracy? Is this a problem? And then something I didn't speak about today at all is this big part of the project, which is about the elite level, where we map accusations of lying between elites and try to understand why accusations happen and whether this has increased indeed or not. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Made for tall people.
Okay.
Right, I'm just gonna back in here.
Start now.
Just get it up first, and I'll put it in the first slide.
Introduce you then.
Yeah. Here. Sounds good. Looks good.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
That's it. Okay.
Do you want to
You
sit
want-
down?
yeah, I can sit down.
Makes it a bit more. So, hi everybody. Good to see you all here, and yeah, excellent turnout today, which is great to see. So, it's my pleasure to introduce today's next speaker, Dr. Emmy Eklundh. Emmy is a senior lecturer at Cardiff University in Wales. Her work focuses on the interconnections between European politics and political and social theory, as a way to offer new ways of thinking about the EU and its member states. This critical approach likewise shapes her thinking on democracy and democratic renewal, and on how the challenges facing today's liberal systems can be meaningfully addressed. Emmy has published widely on populism, the opportunities and risks inherent in left-wing populism, and left-wing progressive opposition to EU politics. She has also highlighted the importance of examining affect and emotions when studying the temporary formations of resistance and disconnect, and has sought to dispel myths and assumptions about an inherently rational center and seemingly irrational forms of opposition to the status quo, work that has been particularly instrumental to my own. Emmy has gone out of her way to share her work with broader audiences through various media contributions, including numerous blogs, op-eds, and interviews. Her commitment to outreach also means she will be giving a talk this evening on left-wing populism at Full Circle, close to Flanders, which is a cultural centre that hosts talks and events for a range of stakeholders working in and around the EU. Emmy has a long day ahead of her, but if you can make it, I would encourage you to go along. Emmy is also very generous with her time, mentoring early career researchers. She delivered a PhD masterclass just yesterday, and was a founding member of the Reactionary Politics Research Network, bit of a mouthful, which brings together researchers to study and tackle the rise of authoritarian and reactionary politics. The network has already become a massive success and is an increasingly important node in critical research on the far right. So we're very grateful to have you with us here today, Emmy, and look forward to hearing more about Europe's populist condition and having you dispel, no doubt, some myths many of us hold about the reasons behind our current political malaise. So the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Omran, and thank you everyone for coming today. I'll stand slightly sideways because I'm not of the same stature as Maurits. So it's always my lecturing curse, if you will. So yeah, I'm here today to talk about my recent book, Europe's Populist Condition. I brought it in the flesh so I can demonstrate that it's actually real, which is sometimes when you write a book, you forget that it's actually going to appear as a physical artifact. And as so much academic work, this has been a long time in the making, so I'll take you on the journey of what has happened and where I'm going with it. And I thought I'd start with the sort of very inception of this book, because that was a while ago, and we're not getting any younger, and I'm reminded of this always when thinking about my work. So I used to work at King's in London, and we were given tickets to this talk by Walter Mignolo. He's a decolonial theorist working in the US, and it was at Tate Britain, which is this very imposing institution that is definitely not, decoloniality is not the first thing you think about when you walk through its door. You think about empire and how great it was. And at that time, I was working a lot about populism, and particularly left-wing populism in Spain, and there was lots of things going on. And Mignolo was starting to talk about what he said is called the colonial matrix of power. And he talked about how colonialism is actually not over, but it's all over. And even though we think that it has ended, its mentality is still here. And he said that this explains a lot of the unequal politics that we have today. Unequal gender relations, capitalism, extraction, the racial order. All of these stem from the colonial heritage, he argues. And that sort of struck a chord with me, because I thought, well, here I am working on populism, and all of the things that we in Europe claim populists to be, gender misogynists, they are sort of favoring capitalism, they're favoring racism, that's thought to be a problem of populism in Europe. It's not thought to be a problem of colonialism. It's not thought to be a problem of Europe in itself and in its own history. So I started to think then, but why don't we talk about this whatsoever? When we talk about populism, why don't we talk about colonialism? Why don't we talk about history? And it made me a bit perplexed, shall we say. And this is what brought me on the journey that results in this book. So it answers the question overall of what if what we call populism in Europe isn't foreign to our political order whatsoever? What if it's not external to who we are, but internal to who we are? And this is why it keeps being so pervasive. This is why we are not getting rid of it, because it is actually not someone else's problem. It is our own problem. And as I started going down this route, all of this evidence came to me that this was actually the case. And I started thinking about how it's not just, European right-wing parties that are populist, but that the same level of thinking exists also at the core of democratic institutions in the European Union. And I like to take this quote by Josep Borrell, who was the High Representative of Foreign Affairs of the European Union. And he gave this talk in Bruges in 2022, where he said that Europe is a garden. We have built a garden. Everything works. It is the best combination of political freedom, economic prosperity, and social cohesion that the humankind has been able to build. And he's not really mincing his words here. He is really committed. The three things together. And here, Bruges is maybe a good representation of beautiful things, intellectual life, well-being. The rest of the world is not exactly a garden. Most of the rest of the world is the jungle. And the jungle could invade the garden. And I think that when we see this is not an extremist in any way or form, is it? This is someone who works at European institutions and is, a defender of liberal democracy. How do these things go together? How is it that it is the populists that are the problem when this is what we have as the defender of our democratic ideals? So this spurred me on further, and now I was really in the process of trying to write the book. So it really just exploded into this type of thinking. And this idea of the European garden is also why I've chose this cover of the book, which I think is the quintessential European garden. It is a picture of Alhambra in Spain, where Christopher Columbus was given the royal charter to go on his so-called discoveries of the Americas. I think that says it all about what the European garden can and cannot be. And in order to further understand this, I wanted to also ask why populism in Europe then is so popular. So not just as a political alternative, because we know that is a popular thing, but as a concept. Why is it that we constantly keep arguing that the threat to democracy comes from populism, when this is our mainstream? And this brought on this idea of what I call the populist condition. And the populist condition, in order to conceptually flesh this out, which I do in the book quite extensively, which I'm happy that you will go away and read very carefully after this talk. And it basically then says that we have a common understanding of liberalism, that it is very antithetical to populism, that the twain shall never meet, and that we are always thinking in this duality of the liberal inside, the liberal center, and its illiberal outside, where populism is one of the outsiders to liberalism. But there is also, I think, increasing evidence that the collaboration between the far right and the liberal center is actually quite close. We know that far right and right-wing populist parties are very keen to adopt neoliberal economic policies, for instance. We also know that centrist liberal parties are quite keen to adopt the very harsh immigration policies that have so long been favored by the far right. Only next week, I think it is, the European Parliament is debating the Common European System of Returns, which is essentially a remigration policy. And if you'd told me 10 years ago that the EU was going to champion a remigration policy to this extent, I think I would not quite have believed it. But here we are. So what is it then that leads us to think that these are such separate entities? And we are also often seeing in the, when we are looking at critiques of anti-populism, so the people in the center that are so hostile to populism, that they are sort of arguing that liberalism is an elite project. But I also want to discuss in this book how populism, in many ways, is also an elite project. It's an elite-driven movement and not always sort of a people-centric movement. And there is a lot of interesting research on this. So I found that there is many questions remaining here about why the sort of mainstreaming of the far right happens. So we have excellent evidence in political science that mainstreaming does happen, and that we are seeing sort of overlaps and interchanges between this liberal center and the right-wing populist and far-right parties. But I find that there is less explanation of why this is so easily happening. Why is it that it's so easy for these liberal parties to just, like, the Brandmauer is just like crumbling apart. There is no cordon sanitaire anymore, I would say, in many European countries. And how does or can coloniality as a concept help us better understand this very strong similarity and affinity between the liberal center and the far right? And in order to do that, I talk a lot about decolonial theory and coloniality in the book. And it takes a very different perspective on how liberal democracy works than what we are typically seeing, both in populism research, but also in democratic theory in Europe more generally. And what it argues is that liberal democracy in Europe is not a very democratic movement, that this has been marred by unequal thinking from day one, and it's marred by a racialized worldview that seems to be very Eurocentric at its heart. So this claim to universality that liberalism always has, that, you know, all human beings are equal and we live in this absolutely fantastic liberal democratic environment in Europe, that this is always forgetting about the sides of liberal democracy that does not make that happen, right? And we recognize that was the case, you know, in the Enlightenment period. We know that women couldn't vote. We know that and people that didn't own property couldn't vote. And people will say, well, yeah, sure, liberalism was very undemocratic at one point, but now we have come to a much better place where we have universal suffrage, etc., etc. But of course, we are well aware that we don't live in an equal society. We know that there are strong impediments to political participation based on class, based on ethnic groups, based on gender, etc. It's not equal. The outcome, obviously, is not equal access to the political decision-making process. So how can we understand this through the lens of coloniality? And this has been developed very much in the sort of Latin American political thought tradition by thinkers such as Quijano, and later Mignolo, Dussel, and Maldonado Torres, who I all draw on quite extensively in the book. And what these thinkers argue essentially is that coloniality and in the colonial times, that this has given us a heritage which we cannot sort of look away from, that our political world is ordered around the thoughts that were constructed at the time. So when we think during the Enlightenment period about the experience of the European white man and how this becomes sort of a universal experience, this is how we measure political life. It is from that condition. And we can't really understand the world outside that experience. And also it is argued in decolonial theory that the whole theory is based, or democratic liberal democracy is based on a sort of misanthropic skepticism, meaning that we have a fundamental disbelief that humans are actually equal, that we cannot really recognize this at a fundamental level, and I'll get back to this. So there is a sort of continued refusal to recognize this throughout liberal democratic theory, which Maldonado Torres calls the worm at the very heart of modernity. It's not something that we've got away from. So what could that look like? What is this inequality that we are talking about? And it stems from what another decolonial theorist, Sylvia Wynter, would argue that she calls it epochal degodding. And it talks... she explains, I think, very eloquently that when we saw the rise of liberalism during the Enlightenment period, that we then did away with the distinction between the spirit and the flesh that was before so very fundamental to politics. Gods were ordaining kings to rule, and this is how political legitimacy was created. We knew that monarchs were legitimate because they had divine intervention, so to speak. When we remove that, when we have the rise of man, and man is supposed to be the ruler of himself, how do we make sure that some rulers are legitimate and some are not? How do we know which rulers are deserving and some are not? And in liberal democratic theory, we're often told that there is this sort of empty space of power. So we, as citizens, are supposed to elect and decide on a ruler that is therefore legitimate to all of us. And this, liberalism argues, is an open process. And what decolonial theory argues is that this open place of power, or empty space of power, never actually exists. That this is something that is decided beforehand because you have to have certain qualities to be able to rule. And this is who the people is, who is included in we the people, always has limits. It is not universal. And that's, I argue, where populism comes in. Populism is not a universal ideology. Populism is a delimitation of who the people is, which always inevitably leaves some people on the outside and not the inside. So populism, I find, and I take quite a, shall we say, radical approach to what is currently being understood as populism. We are often stuck in debates about, like, oh, is it a strategic thing to do, populism? Is it ideological? Is it a discourse? And sort of 20 years of this, like, going back and forth between these topics. I think that this is a futile debate at the end of the day, because we need to not situate populism as opposed to our general liberal democratic landscape. It's part of what liberalism does. It is not foreign to it. And if we start looking at this sort of reduced distance between elitism and populism, which there is excellent research in this area, then populism now, as we know, is part of the European mainstream. If you look at the composition of the European Parliament since the election 2 years ago, we cannot possibly say that populism is a fringe phenomenon. It's not. It's a mainstream phenomenon. And we need to start treating it as such and treating it as something who we are and not as something that is external to us. So I argue that we as researchers of populism really struggle with this, really struggle to internalize populism as an internal problem to democracy and not foreign to it. And one of the explanatory factors that I offer in the book, why that is that we are so committed to seeing populism as something that is outside of us, I use the concept of fantasy and psychoanalytical theories to try to better understand why it is that we keep coming back to this, that populism is someone else. It's not something that we do as Europeans, it's something else that happens outside of us. And I think that there is or I demonstrate in the book that there is quite a lot of thinking that the European democratic sphere is sort of an apex of an equal and civilized society. And therefore, we can't have things like populism. We can't sort of internalize that people are misogynists, that gender equality is going backwards in many European countries. We can't internalize that migration policies on Europe's borders are equally violent as they are in the United States many times. This is not something that is part of the European story. So I think that there is a need for us to start recognizing populism not as a challenge to the status quo, but part of the status quo. In this sense, I don't think it is part of what is often in post-structural democratic theory called the political. It's not. It's actually something that is just inside the order and not outside of it. And for those in the room that are very into democratic theory and very into how we might look at how democratic claims are are constructed, I thought that a slight illustration of how I see populism is needed. So we often think that in the sort of challenge to democracy that we have this sort of people-elite distinction. This is often what populist theory wants us to believe, that the people is sort of challenging the status quo, which is managed by the elites. And what I would like to argue is that all of this square here is part of the same liberal order of coloniality. So there is no challenge to the status quo from populist parties. They're all part and parcel of the same thing. So it is part of the current European form. And I think that there is a helpful way of looking at why we keep coming back to this, and to say that this separation between the people of the elite is actually a fantasy. It's not something that we can establish very well when we look at party claims and how populists relate to European politics. So it becomes kind of a facade behind which we can hide these more ugly leanings of European politics. That we say, well, oh yeah, sure, we may have all of this harsh migration policies, we may have a sort of backtracking on human rights, we may have a sort of pushbacks against trans politics, etc. But that's not us. That's something else. That's the populists that are doing it. We're only doing that because we are being forced by the right-wing populists. And actually, we don't really want to do it, but we need to do it because it's those people forcing us to do it. So this idea that there is a separation between the mainstream, good, benevolent European continent and the outsiders is absolutely essential to uphold this fantasy of who Europeans are. And we often also label populist movements as transgressive, as they are doing something that isn't really allowed, they are offering something else that we aren't currently seeing in the political mainstream. And I think that is also largely a myth that we need to dispel. So and we need to tell ourselves this story. We have a lot of enjoyment invested in Europe into being the good guys. We are the ones that are sort of saving the world. We are the ones that are, I'm from Sweden, and I mean, I don't know how many times I've seen Swedish politicians call Sweden the moral superpower of the world. I'm like, it's laughable. It's great that you laugh because I also laugh. And then I cry afterwards because it's not actually very funny. So I think that's the image that we have, but it's not the other side of Europe is also here, right? It's not something that we can hide. So then when I wrote this book, I thought, well, it's great. I can demonstrate how this happens in the liberal center. It's quite easy. There is a lot of research as well that has happened in this area. What is less researched, I find, is that this, what I call the populist condition, is also present on the left, and how left-wing populist parties also fall prey to many of these, I would say, colonialist leanings of the populist condition. And I argue that the European populist condition is present on the left mainly in two ways. One part I've looked at deals with the gender politics of the populist left, and the other part deals with what I think is a sort of nation-state romanticism or commitment to nationalism at the end of the day. And I find that this type of politics demonstrates how left populist parties are often more European than they are left, and that this is a quite damaging strategy for left-wing politics more generally in Europe. So let's go, I'll take about another few minutes to go through these before finishing up. So when we talk about the gendered politics of left-wing populists, there is great research in this area and that has investigated how populist leaders on the left actually promote a very sort of alpha male repertoire, and this is not something that is very compatible necessarily with this, you know, gender equal, fantastic idea that we're supposed to be living in the European continent. So first here I wanted to look at, and I've looked very much in my research on a Spanish case of left-wing party Podemos, and here we have it's a very great case of different types of masculinities that are coming through the fore. So it's not perhaps the traditional masculinity like, you know, Pete Hegseth type of masculinity, like I'm an army bro. That's not where we are. But it's a sort of feminist masculinity. So the policies of Podemos can be or are quite good in terms of gender equality. But if you look at the presentation of the party, it becomes less so. So there is a lot of research, and I've also done some other research in the book on how this alpha male behavior comes through in the leadership of Podemos. And particularly, I've looked at what's called the socialist fraternal kiss, which some of you may have seen before. It was happening the first time. This is picture in the background between Brezhnev and Erich Honecker as a sort of social male bond that was or socialist male bond that was definitely supposed to strengthen the Soviet Union and all of its allies at the time. And Pablo Iglesias has sort of adopted this as a practice. He's like, I'm going to do the socialist fraternal kiss. This is going to be great. So he's taken to kissing his male colleagues on the mouth in numerous occasions. If you Google it, there are millions of pictures of him doing this. Why is this a problem? Well, he would hopefully not do this to his female colleagues, right? And he doesn't really do it to his female colleagues. So the socialist fraternal kiss is what is often termed in feminist theory as the homosocial bond, that politics becomes something between men, that you are only included in this community if you are male. And this is something that Pablo Iglesias is quite into. He's also labeled himself as kind of an aggressive intellectual. And there is also this, I would say, very high-end sexual harassment case against his former co-leader, Íñigo Errejón. There's even been a television show made in Spain which deals directly with this sexual harassment scandal, where they are talking about a character called Iñaki Castejón, which, you know, you can definitely see what they are referring to here. So this is one part, I would say, of how left-wing populism doesn't manage to go beyond this colonialist thinking and world-making. I've also in the book looked at the party, the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany, to look at their gender policies, which is also a very depressing read and research. Here we have party officials saying that, I understand that gender gets on people's nerves because people just don't care. And this is not a central question for the party. And they've also been called in many ways like a conservative left, which doesn't want patriarchy introduced by the back door, i.e. they're saying, we don't want migrants that would have different types of gender inequality, values that we obviously don't have in enlightened Germany, etc., etc. So the gender politics of the populist left is not a very refreshing or progressive read, if you will. And I would argue that the same is a case when you look at the commitments to nationalism in the populist left. And there has been quite a lot of work in populism studies saying that populism is different from nationalism. And this is a long-standing debate. But I would argue, and I do so in this book as well, that if we engage with the concept of coloniality, the distinction between populism in Europe and nationalism becomes very small. And that we can't really separate this type of community making in Europe from the development of the European nation state. And we are seeing this in many left-wing populist parties, that there's quite a strong commitment to nationalism, and that the nation is seen as a key form of political community that is supposed to salvage the left, which, as we know, it hasn't, but it's still sort of propelled this way. And I draw here on ideas of Foucault and other scholars who argue that the sovereign people in a modern state is always done through a racialized conception of that people, which is very much in line with what decolonial scholars would say about the political community of Europe. And Foucault even goes as far as to call it a race war, right? So that there is no state sovereignty without the creation of racialized difference. And this, I would say, sort of falls back into the same argument as the decolonial scholars that I use in the book. And the similar references to a left-wing nation can also be seen in Jeremy Corbyn when he was part of leader of UK Labour Party, where he was, even though he didn't say so, he was, I would say, in favor of Brexit, thinking that this, the British jobs for British people, this is something that is quite key to his politics. Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France has also been quite committed to this sort of neo-republicanism in France, where you are also conceiving of the state and the nation is in quite restricted terms. And the Bündnisser Wagenknecht is also very committed to nationalism, very anti-immigration, and has, I would say, very much policies that are at odds with any type of left-wing internationalism. So just to conclude with all of these thoughts, I know it's difficult to sort of squeeze a book into a 30-minute talk, but just to reiterate that the book argues overall that populism is not foreign to Europe, that we have a populist condition that has been with us for some time and doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. And that populism is a simple continuation of a colonial world order, which is why I would say most political parties in Europe are quite easily adopting what we normally call populist policies, and that they can now be seen left, right, and center. But that we as populism researchers and some researchers on liberal democracy in Europe more generally are not very attuned to this reality and continue to treat populist parties as anomalies, as outsiders, as something which goes on in the fringe when it is actually quite the center. And I think that the concept of fantasy can really help us understand how we enjoy thinking of ourselves as the benevolent continent, something that we are proud of, that Europe has this long-standing history of equality, and we're not very keen on having that fantasy shattered or challenged in any way. And even though there's been quite a lot of research on sort of mainstreaming on how liberal parties adopt right-wing populist policies, I find that there is in the book I offer quite a lot of substance on how left-wing populists are also affected by the populist condition. Okay, thank you so much for your attention.
Hey everybody, so as said before, before we go to the Q&A, we'll have a very short break. You can quickly go to the bathroom, have a drink or something, but we'll return in 5 minutes, okay?